He had spent years saving lives with steady hands, a calm voice, and the kind of authority people trusted without question. But on that street, under flashing lights, none of that seemed to matter. A police officer reduced a respected surgeon to a public suspicion, while a quiet witness across the road kept recording every second. And as the humiliation deepened, one question began to settle over the scene. Who was really losing control? Before this story unfolds, like and subscribe to Court of Kramer, where hidden truth rises, power falls, and justice always finds its voice. The police cruiser had been idling near the curb long enough for Officer Grant to grow restless, scanning passing cars with the casual certainty of a man who trusted his instincts more than procedure. Then he saw the black sedan glide to a clean stop at the light. It was polished, quiet, expensive, without being flashy. Behind the wheel sat a black man in a tailored coat, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other adjusting the cuff of a pale blue shirt with the absent precision of someone used to order. Grant noticed the watch first, then the car, then the man's composure, and from those three details built a story in seconds. It was the kind of story he had told himself many times before, one where confidence looked suspicious, only because it came from the wrong person. By the time the light changed, his mind was already made up. His cruiser pulled out hard, lights flashing sharp against the darkening street. The sedan eased over at once. No hesitation, no panic, no resistance. That should have meant something. Instead, Grant stepped out with his jaw set and one hand near his belt, already wearing the posture of control. Inside the stopped Tonto car, the surgeon waited in silence, calm enough to make the officer feel challenged before a single word was said. Grant didn't begin with a question, he began with a tone. License, registration. Step carefully, he said, loud enough for the pedestrians near the corner to hear. Two people waiting outside a pharmacy turned their heads. A man by a food cart slowed down. The flashing lights had already created a stage, and Grant seemed determined to use it. The surgeon handed over his documents without argument. Grant looked at the license, then back at the car, then at the neatly pressed coat. "This your vehicle?" he asked, though the registration was already in his hand. "You sure you didn't borrow something that doesn't belong to you?" The surgeon held his gaze. "It's mine, officer." Grant gave a dry laugh. "Right. And the watch too?" His eyes moved over the surgeon's shirt, cufflinks, polished shoes, searching his appearance like it was evidence of a lie. "You dressed like this for what? Trying to look important?" A few more people had stopped now. Nobody said anything, but the silence around them grew heavier. The surgeon remained still, shoulders relaxed, voice even. He did not shrink, did not stammer, did not offer the nervous energy Grant seemed to want from him. That calm only made the officer sharper, louder, more certain that dignity itself was an insult. Grant took a half step closer to the window, close enough now that the stop no longer looked routine. It looked personal. "You know what your problem is, Bird," he said. "Men like you think a nice car and a polished voice can make people ignore what you really are." A few heads turned more sharply at that. The words landed hard in the cold air, ugly enough that even the people watching seemed unsure where to look. Grant held the surgeon's license between two fingers as if it offended him. Then he reached for the door handle. "Out of the car, now." The surgeon finally moved, but only enough to lift his eyes fully to the officer's face. There was no anger in them, which somehow made the moment heavier. "Officer," he said quietly, "before you do anything else, you should think very carefully about what happens next." Grant's mouth tightened. He had expected fear, maybe pleading, maybe outrage. Not calm, not a warning delivered like fact. For one brief second, the noise of the street seemed to fall back. The bystanders watched. The lights kept flashing. And Grant, feeling that silence like a challenge, made the worst choice he could make. He pulled the door open anyway. The door swung open with a force that made the moment feel staged, as if Grant needed the sound of it to prove he was still in charge. The surgeon stepped out slowly, one polished shoe touching pavement, then the other, his movements controlled enough to make the officer's aggression look even rougher by comparison. Grant circled him with narrowed eyes, not searching for danger so much as assembling a reason to justify what he had already decided. He glanced at the surgeon's coat pocket, then at the leather bag resting on the passenger seat. "What's in that?" he demanded. "It's my work bag." "Work doing what?" the surgeon answered evenly. "I'm on my way home." Grant ignored it. His gaze landed on the hospital parking decal near the windshield, then twisted it into something suspicious. "Funny. You people always have some little badge, some little pass, something to make yourselves look official. He held up the license again, studying the address, the title on one of the cards in the wallet, the clean interior of the car, every ordinary detail treated like a clue to a crime that did not exist. The more normal everything looked, the more irritated he seemed. Instead of correcting himself, he kept digging, determined to make innocence look rehearsed. Grant stepped back just enough to put on a show. His hand rose to his radio, and his voice changed into something flatter, louder, meant to be heard as much by the growing crowd as by dispatch. "Need another unit," he said. "Possible non-compliance subject, situation uncertain." It was a lie dressed in procedure. The surgeon had not raised his voice, had not resisted, had not done anything except stand where he was told. But the word non-compliant changed the atmosphere at once. The bystanders shifted. A woman near the pharmacy frowned. The man with the food cart stopped pretending not to watch. Grant used that tension like fuel. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he snapped, though the surgeon's hands had never moved. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The flashing lights painted the surgeon's face in cold pulses of red and blue, turning stillness into spectacle. Grant squared his shoulders and widened his stance, performing danger where there was none, making the calm man in front of him look like a threat through force of repetition alone. Yet the surgeon did not match the energy being pushed onto him. He stood straight, breathing evenly, his expression controlled, almost clinical. And in that restraint, there was something unsettlingly solid, as if he understood the scene better than the officer trying to direct it. When Grant barked another order, the surgeon answered without haste, his voice low and exact. "I have followed every instruction you've given." Grant's jaw shifted. "Then explain why you're acting nervous." "I'm not nervous," the surgeon said. "I'm being careful." The distinction seemed to irritate the officer more than open defiance would have. The surgeon glanced once at his own open car door, then back at Grant, measuring each word before releasing it. "You initiated this stop. I complied immediately. I provided identification. I have not resisted you in any way." The phrasing was precise, almost formal, and several people nearby seemed to notice it. This was not the language of panic. It was the language of someone trained to stay steady when others lost control. Grant folded his arms. "You talk like you think you're smarter than everybody." The surgeon did not rise to it. "No, officer, I talk like someone who understands the importance of record, sequence, and consequence." For the first time, that answer created a faint shift in the air around them. A few bystanders exchanged glances. Across the street, a young woman standing near the bus bench lowered her phone from her ear, turned it sideways, and began recording. The moment the young woman lifted her phone, the stop changed shape. Until then, Grant had controlled the scene with volume, posture, and the easy confidence of a man used to being believed first. But once the camera pointed in his direction, the air around him grew less certain. He was no longer just managing one driver on a dim street. He was performing for strangers whose silence he could not read, and whose memory would not depend on his report. More people began to notice. A teenager near the bus shelter nudged his friend and pulled out his own phone. The man at the food cart leaned farther over his counter for a better view. Two women outside the pharmacy stopped pretending to browse the window and turned fully toward the flashing lights. No one stepped in. No one had to. Their attention alone was enough to change the rhythm of the scene. Grant seemed to feel it. His voice got sharper, more official, as if louder words could reclaim authority from the glass screens now reflecting him back. But the witnesses kept watching. Yet, and the simple fact of being watched had started doing what the surgeon never could. It made the officer visible. From the sidewalk, the details looked different than they did from inside Grant's assumptions. One of the women near the pharmacy narrowed her eyes and whispered, "Is that a hospital ID?" The badge clip near the surgeon's coat pocket had shifted just enough to catch the light. Another bystander noticed the monogram on his cuff. The young woman recording zoomed in slightly, not with excitement, but with the careful attention of someone starting to realize this was not what it appeared to be. What stood out most was the surgeon himself. He wasn't slurring, shaking, arguing, or posturing. He answered directly. He stood straight. Even under the glare of the lights and the pressure of public humiliation, yet he carried himself with a kind of practiced steadiness that felt familiar to anyone who had ever trusted a serious professional. "Listen to how he talks," the teenager near the bus stop muttered under his breath. "He sounds like a doctor or something." That quiet recognition moved through the small crowd in fragments, never loud enough to interrupt the stop, but enough to soften the officer's version of events, and Grant, catching those glances and whispers without fully hearing them, seemed to sense the shift. Instead of backing off, his posture hardened, as if being doubted in public only made him more determined to win. Grant's eyes moved across the crowd, then back to the surgeon, and something in him seemed to snap at the sight of those phones held steady. He stepped forward again. So invading the small space the surgeon had maintained with such deliberate calm. "You think standing there and talking polished is going to save you?" he said loud enough for every bystander to hear. "I know your type. Men like you hide behind titles and clothes, then act offended when real police work catches up." Before the surgeon could answer, Grant shoved a hand against his shoulder and forced him back against the side of the car. Gasps broke from the sidewalk. The young woman recording flinched but did not lower her phone. The surgeon's badge slipped free from his coat as he hit the doorframe. It swung into plain view under the lights. Grant looked directly at it. Then, in full view of the cameras, he grabbed it, glanced once at the hospital seal, and tossed it onto the pavement like it meant nothing. And the silence that followed felt enormous. That was the moment the scene stopped being merely humiliating. It became undeniable. Not a tense stop, not a misunderstanding. A choice, captured cleanly from more than one angle, already beginning to travel far beyond the people standing there on the curb. The badge lay face up near the curb, caught in the wash of red and blue light. For a second nobody moved. Then the woman by the pharmacy stepped forward just enough to read the name, and stopped cold. "Oh my God," she whispered, not to the officer but to herself. "I know him." Grant barely looked at her. He was still focused on the surgeon, as if force alone could keep the moment from shifting. But the woman's expression had already changed, and others nearby noticed it. "That's Dr. Elias Warren," she said, louder now. "He's a surgeon at St. Catherine's." A murmur passed through the crowd. The teenager at the bus stop looked from the badge to the man beside the car and back again. Suddenly the calm voice, the measured language, the impossible composure, under pressure, all made sense. The surgeon did not rush to confirm it. He simply adjusted his sleeve where Grant had grabbed him and said in the same steady tone, "I have patients waiting for me tomorrow morning. I would prefer not to spend the night explaining why this became necessary." It was not a boast, it was not even a reveal, it was a statement shaped by discipline, the kind spoken by someone used to responsibility, precision, and stakes larger than ego. And for the first time the crowd was no longer just watching a man being humiliated, or just they were watching a respected professional being treated like he was disposable. Across the street, the young woman with the phone did more than keep recording. She stepped back, typed quickly, and sent the clip to someone she knew at St. Catherine's. Within minutes, it began moving through private messages, staff group chats, and late-shift conversations with the speed that only recognition could create. At the hospital, a nurse in scrubs paused in a corridor and stared at her screen. A resident on break replayed the video twice, disbelieving at first that the man pinned beside the car was the same surgeon who could steady an operating room with a few quiet words. In another corner of the building, someone forwarded it again with nothing but his name. That name was enough. Dr. Elias Warren was not simply known, and he was trusted. Staff who had seen him work under impossible pressure recognized the same discipline now holding him together on that roadside. The contrast made the clip harder to ignore and impossible to excuse. What had begun as one officer's public display was now entering circles built on memory, reputation, and influence. People who understood exactly who Warren was were no longer seeing an anonymous man at a traffic stop. They were seeing one of their own. And once that recognition took hold, the question was no longer what happened on the street. It was who, beyond the hospital itself, would see it next. Within minutes, the identity behind the badge stopped being local sidewalk gossip and became something heavier. One of the bystanders had already sent the clip to a group chat tied to St. Catherine's. No, another shared a screenshot with a relative in hospital administration. Names moved fast when they belonged to people whose work had touched too many lives to stay anonymous for long. "Dr. Warren," someone said from the crowd, this time with disbelief instead of uncertainty. "The cardiosurgeon?" Grant's expression tightened, but the street had already shifted beyond him. The young woman recording glanced at her phone, then back up, watching replies stack in real time. Recognition was no longer speculative. It was spreading through circles that knew exactly who Elias Warren was, what he did, and how impossible this scene would look once the right people saw it. The surgeon still did not plead his case. He simply bent, picked up his badge from the pavement, and brushed it clean with careful fingers. Then, with the same measured calm that had unsettled Grant from the start, he said, "Officer, I strongly suggest you stop treating this like a street performance. You are no longer the only one documenting it." Grant frowned at the wording, but one of the bystanders had already muttered the sentence that would follow the footage into bigger rooms. "He's close to the board." By the time the street had gone quiet again, the footage was already moving through hands far removed from the flashing lights that created it. It reached phones in staff lounges, private offices, and late-night kitchen tables where people replayed difficult things with the sound turned low. In each room, the same details stood out more sharply with every viewing. The surgeon's composure, the officer's tone, the shove against the car, the badge tossed to the pavement as if dignity itself were disposable. At St. Catherine's, the clip landed first, with people trained to notice precision. A nurse watched it once and covered her mouth. An administrator replayed the sequence from the moment Grant grabbed the badge. A senior physician paused on the officer's face, then let the video continue in silence. No one in those rooms needed the scene explained. They understood optics. More than that, they understood ethics, status, and the damage done when power turns public and careless. The footage had begun as spectacle, but in these hands it became evidence, not emotional rumor, not an exaggerated retelling. Evidence with angles, timestamps, voices, and a victim too respected to dismiss. And as the clip reached people accustomed to making serious decisions, the first layer of shock gave way to something more dangerous for Officer Grant: recognition. The clip reached the hospital board before midnight. It was first opened in silence, passed from one phone to another in a private thread that usually dealt with budgets, policy, and expansion plans rather than public humiliation. But the moment Elias Warren's face appeared under the police lights, that silence changed. One board member sat upright at her desk. Another replayed the shove twice as if disbelief required confirmation. A third stopped the video only when the badge hit the pavement. They did not need introductions. They knew his record, his reputation, the lives attached to his hands, the discipline it had taken for him to remain that calm while being treated like a threat in public. Yet what disturbed them most was not only that it had happened, it was how easily it had happened, how confidently, how openly, as if the officer believed no one important would ever see it. He handled that with more restraint than most people could, one member said quietly. Another answered with less control. That man was humiliated on camera. And for the first time since the stop began, authority was reacting with the seriousness the moment deserved. Not with noise, not with excuses, but with the cold, immediate understanding that something had to be done next. Outrage did not stay inside the board thread for long. It became action. Names were checked first. Officer Grant, badge number, patrol division, shift supervisor. Someone on the board knew a city attorney. Someone else had the private number of a deputy commissioner. Another forwarded the clip with a brief message stripped of emotion because emotion was no longer necessary. The footage spoke cleanly on its own. At the same time, administrators at St. Catherine's began assembling context with the efficiency of people used to crisis. Time of stop, location, witness accounts, confirmation that Dr. Warren had left the hospital after a late case and had been due back for surgery consults the next morning. Every detail tightened the frame around what had happened and made the officer's behavior look smaller, meaner, harder to defend. Then the first call reached Grant's chain of command. It was followed by another, then another. By the time midnight passed, the department had not yet made a public move. But pressure was already building in the quiet places that mattered most. The footage was no longer just circulating. It was climbing, and every floor it reached made denial more expensive. Inside the department, the first reaction was not outrage, it was containment. Grant's supervisor watched the footage with two other command staff in a cramped office lit by a desk lamp and the pale glow of a monitor. No one liked what they saw, but even then the instinct was familiar. Slow it down, narrow the language, turn a public humiliation into something procedural enough to survive review. Traffic stop escalated, one of them said, already reaching for the safest version of events. Subject was removed from the vehicle. Crowd presence increased tension. Optics are bad. But optics aren't the whole report. Another officer paused the video just before the shove, as if freezing. The frame could somehow soften what came next. We need body cam before anybody jumps to conclusions. It was a selective caution, less about truth than delay. They talked about sequence, policy wording, officer perception, compliance thresholds, all the phrases institutions use when they need time to decide whether they are protecting standards or protecting themselves. No one said Grant looked reasonable. No one said he looked right. But neither did anyone rush to condemn him. For a few strained minutes, they tried to press the footage into the shape of routine policing. Then the calls from outside started reaching the building, a gig and routine became much harder to sell. The problem was that the video refused to cooperate with anyone trying to soften it. Every replay made the same things harder to excuse. Grant was the one who set the tone. Grant was the one who kept escalating. The surgeon's hands were visible. His answers were measured. There was no blur of movement to hide behind, no chaotic struggle, no split-second threat that might rescue the officer's judgment after the fact. Just a slow public sequence of choices growing worse each time they were repeated on screen. Even with the sound low, his aggression came through clearly. With the sound on, it was devastating. The language alone stripped away most of the department's safer explanations. This was not a tense officer reacting under pressure. It was a man speaking with open contempt, then using procedure like cover after the fact. And when the badge appeared, followed by the shove and the toss to the pavement, the room went still in the way people do when denial is no longer useful. Outside the department, the clip was spreading faster than any internal memo could contain. Inside, every attempted defense sounded thinner than the last. They were no longer shaping the story. They were already behind it. Grant was still telling himself the situation could be managed when his phone began vibrating across the metal desk. He glanced at the screen, expecting a routine callback from his shift sergeant. Instead, he saw 3 missed calls, one message from a lieutenant telling him not to leave the building, and another from a union rep asking what exactly he had done, which the confidence he had worn so easily on the roadside began to thin. Then his supervisor stepped into the room, holding a printout and a face Grant had never seen on him before. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. "Do you understand who that was?" the supervisor asked. Grant said nothing. "That man is Dr. Elias Warren, cardiothoracic surgeon, St. Catherine's. And before you ask, yes, the board knows. Several of them know him personally." For the first time that night, Grant's expression broke. Not dramatically, just enough for the certainty to drain out of it. His eyes shifted once, then again, as if looking for a version of the evening that no longer existed. He had thought he was embarrassing a stranger no one would defend. And now he understood that the man he shoved against a car was respected in rooms Grant would never enter, and those rooms were already moving. Alone in the interview room, Grant discovered that memory could be crueler than accusation. The stop kept replaying in sharp fragments, each one worse now that he understood how many phones had been pointed at him. His own words came back first, stripped of the confidence that had carried them on the street. "Men like you, trying to look important, non-compliant subject." He heard the ugliness in them now, not because his beliefs had changed, but because consequence had given them definition. Then came the shove, the badge, the careless flick of his hand, sending it to the pavement. At the time, each act had felt temporary, swallowed by the ordinary chaos of a stop. Now every second looked fixed, preserved, waiting to be replayed by supervisors, lawyers, strangers, reporters, anyone who wanted to see exactly what kind of man he had been when he thought no one powerful mattered. Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, jaw tight. For the first time all night, he could not hide inside motion or volume. The scene no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the footage, and the footage was cleaner, calmer, and far less forgiving than his own memory. By morning, the consequences had started arriving faster than Grant could process them. Internal Affairs wanted a statement. His supervisor warned him that administrative leave was already being discussed. The union representative, who had sounded confident the night before, now spoke in clipped, careful phrases. "You were asking whether there was anything else on video that the department had not seen yet." Outside the building, the anger was widening. The clip had spread beyond hospital circles and into the community, where people saw exactly what the department had hoped to blur. Not confusion, not fear, but contempt wearing a badge. Calls came in, complaints multiplied. Local reporters started asking for comment before sunrise. Inside the station, the distance around Grant became its own kind of verdict. Officers who had joked with him days earlier now kept their eyes elsewhere. One muttered that the footage looked bad. Another said nothing at all and walked past him like he was already gone. It wasn't just his job beginning to crack. It was the version of himself he had relied on for years. Competent, untouchable, backed by the room. But now every hallway felt narrower, every glance more deliberate, every silence louder. And with that pressure closing in, Grant did what men like him often do when consequence finally arrives. He started reaching for excuses. When Grant was finally asked to explain himself, he reached for the oldest defense he had. He said the surgeon had seemed evasive. He said the car had looked out of place. He said the man's tone had felt disrespectful, too controlled, too polished, too certain of himself. Every sentence was meant to sound procedural, but the longer he spoke, the clearer the real problem became. He had not responded to danger. He had responded to confidence he believed did not belong in front of him. His supervisor let him talk long enough to expose it fully. "So you escalated because he was calm?" he asked. Aunt Grant's face tightened. "No, I escalated because I know when something feels wrong." But nothing in the footage supported instinct, only irritation, not at resistance, at dignity. Even now, with the clip spreading and his career narrowing by the hour, Grant could not describe what the surgeon had done without revealing what he hated. The education in his voice, the restraint in his posture, the refusal to become smaller just to make authority comfortable. By the time he stopped talking, the room had gone cold. And miles away from the station, Dr. Elias Warren was no longer deciding whether what happened mattered. He was deciding how it would be answered. When Elias Warren finally closed the door behind him, the silence of his home felt heavier than the street had. He set his keys down with steady hands. But the steadiness cost him more now that no one was watching. The humiliation he had refused to display in public began settling into him in quieter forms, the memory of the officer's grip on his shoulder, the voices of strangers forced to witness it, the awful familiarity of being judged before being seen. He sat for a long moment without removing his coat. What stung was not only the disrespect, it was the calculation behind it, the instant decision that his calm, his success, even his presence inside that car had to be explained as something false. He had spent years mastering control in operating rooms where panic could kill. That same discipline had protected him on the roadside, but discipline was not the same as not feeling. He felt all of it, not loudly, not theatrically, just deeply. And once the private hurt had fully arrived, it began to harden into something more useful than anger, not revenge, not pride, precision. By sunrise, Elias had already decided what he would not do. He would not go on television in anger. He would not trade insult for insult. He would not let a man who had reduced him in public dictate the dignity of his response afterward. Instead, he sat at his dining table with a legal pad, his phone, and the same disciplined focus he brought into surgery. He wrote down the stop in sequence: time, wording, movements, commands, witnesses, the exact moment the badge left Grant's hand and struck the pavement. No exaggeration, no dramatic flourish, only fact, order, and clarity. Then he sent the account through the channels that mattered: hospital leadership, legal counsel, a formal complaint. He answered questions precisely, gave names where he had them, and left silence where he did not. The footage would do the rest. That restraint gave his response unusual force. He was not asking anyone to feel sorry for him. He was giving them a record they could not easily ignore. By the time the statements were in motion, the story no longer belonged to roadside emotion. It belonged to evidence, discipline, and people trained to act when both were placed in front of them. By the time Elias finished his formal statement, the footage had already been reviewed enough times to make comparison simple. His account did not compete with the video. It fit inside it with exact, almost unsettling precision. The sequence matched, the wording matched, even the pauses matched. Where the footage was visual, his statement gave structure. Where his statement was restrained, the footage supplied the emotional force. Together they left almost nothing to argue with. There was no meaningful gap for the department to hide inside, no contradiction for Grant to exploit, no ambiguity broad enough to rescue intent from behavior. The camera showed the contempt. Elias's account explained the consequence. Each made the other stronger. People who might have resisted a single version of events now had two forms of the same truth: calm and undeniable. A respected surgeon had been publicly humiliated by an officer who mistook bias for authority, and that mistake had been documented from beginning to end. By afternoon, the question was no longer whether something had happened. The question was how many institutions would now be forced to respond to the exact same conclusion at once. The official response came without the protective language the department had hoped to hide behind. Internal review moved faster once the footage, witness statements, and Elias Warren's formal account all converged on the same conclusion. By late afternoon, Grant was placed on administrative suspension, pending full disciplinary action, and the department announced an investigation into conduct, use of force, and discriminatory treatment during the stop. For the first time since the lights flashed on that street, the balance of power had fully turned. No supervisor could call it routine now. No spokesperson could smooth it into misunderstanding. The evidence had become too public, too coherent, and too damaging to contain. But even the officers who had once tried to slow the process now understood that shielding Grant would only deepen the scandal. Then came the detail that made it feel irreversible. His badge and service weapon were taken. It was done quietly, inside the building, away from cameras. But word spread anyway. The officer who had treated authority like personal property was now being stripped of it piece by piece by the same institution he thought would protect him. And once official punishment began, the private collapse of his reputation was not far behind. The public fallout came harder than Grant had expected, and with far less sympathy. Once local stations ran the footage, his authority collapsed outside the department as completely as it had inside it. Viewers did not see a difficult split-second judgment. They saw a man enjoying power until the truth made him small. His name spread through comment sections, neighborhood groups, and city conversations with the speed reserved for people who become symbols of something larger than themselves. Every replay stripped away another layer of the confidence he had worn on that street. The uniform that once gave him presence now seemed to expose him instead, turning arrogance into evidence and habit into disgrace. Former supporters grew quiet. Public statements from city officials became sharper. Even the language around him changed. No longer officer involved in incident. Now it was the officer seen on video, the officer under investigation, the officer accused of bias and abuse. That shift mattered. It took away the shield of title and replaced it with scrutiny. By the end of the day, Grant was no longer the center of command in anyone's mind. He was the cautionary image in a story about overreach, prejudice, and collapse. And as his false authority fell apart in public, something equally important began happening on the other side of the story. People started making room for Elias Warren to be seen clearly again. As the officer's world narrowed, Elias's began to widen again in the way it should have from the start. Hospital leadership released a statement of support that was careful but unmistakable, affirming both his professionalism and the seriousness of what had been done to him. Colleagues who had watched the footage with disbelief now spoke with open admiration, not only for the work he had done for years, but for the restraint he had shown when humiliation would have broken many people. Well, patients and families added their voices too. Some knew him as the surgeon who had stayed late to explain difficult outcomes in plain language. Others remembered the calm steadiness that had once guided them through the worst day of their lives. That same steadiness, now seen under police lights, carried a different kind of weight. What mattered most was simple. He was believed. Not politely, not conditionally, fully. The story was no longer just about a man being mistreated on a roadside. It was about a respected surgeon being recognized in full view of the public, with his dignity restored by the very clarity that had once been used against him. And once that recognition settled into place, the story was finally ready to move beyond punishment and into meaning. Power had looked simple at the beginning of the stop. A cruiser, a badge, a raised voice, a man certain that public force would be enough to define reality. But power built on prejudice is always weaker than it first appears, because it depends on silence, fear, and the hope that no one important will look too closely. The moment that hope fails, the structure starts to crack. That was the deeper collapse in Grant's story. Not just discipline, exposure. He had mistaken control for legitimacy. He had believed that humiliation, if delivered with enough confidence, could pass as order. Instead, every act meant to make Elias smaller became proof of Grant's own smallness once the scene was seen clearly. The same public setting he used to dominate became the setting that undid him. And that is how abuse of power often ends when it is fully witnessed, not with one dramatic explosion, but with a steady reversal. The voice that once commanded becomes evidence. The title that once protected becomes fragile. And the person who was expected to shrink becomes the clearest figure in the story. The next morning, Elias returned to the hospital before sunrise, when the corridors were still quiet and the building felt more like discipline than noise. Nurses greeted him with a softness that carried respect rather than pity. A resident standing near the elevator straightened when he saw him, then offered a small nod. Elias returned without breaking stride. Inside the operating wing, everything that had made him who he was still waited for him unchanged. Charts, monitors, sterile light. Lives depending on steady judgment. The work did not ask for outrage. It asked for precision, calm, and the ability to keep moving with care even after being wounded by the world outside. That contrast said more than any speech could. Where Grant had relied on volume, Elias moved in quiet competence. Where the officer had tried to reduce him in public, the hospital restored him through recognition no one needed to perform. He was not treated like a symbol. He was treated like himself, and that, more than the headlines or the investigations, completed something essential. The roadside humiliation had not broken the man at its centre. He returned to the place where his skill, discipline, and dignity had always been real. From there, the story could move toward its final meaning. Later that evening, when the city had already begun folding the story into headlines, complaints, and official statements, the original footage kept circulating for one simple reason. It had become impossible to watch without seeing two men revealed at once. One stood under flashing lights and believed the badge on his chest gave him the right to define whoever stood in front of him. The other said almost nothing, offered no performance, and still emerged larger with every replay. Grant had pulled Elias Warren over, thinking he was confronting a stranger he could reduce, embarrass, and send back into silence. Instead, he had placed his own character in full view, not by accident, by choice. That was the final reversal. The surgeon never needed to shout, threaten, or prove himself on the roadside. Time, evidence, and the truth did that work for him. And the officer who thought he was exposing someone suspicious ended up exposing something far more permanent, his own prejudice, his own hunger for control, and the emptiness behind the authority he wore so confidently. In the end, he did not uncover a lie, he revealed himself.